Good afternoon in Georgetown, and good evening, good morning elsewhere. My name's Helen Herman, and I have the very special pleasure to introduce Dr. Lakshmi Vijayakumar to those who don't know her. So Dr. Lakshmi is founder of SNEHA. It's a pioneering suicide prevention organization in Chennai, Tamil Nadu in India. And for those that don't know SNEHA, this is an organization that began locally and continues as a local volunteer-based organization helping people in need, but has achieved a national and global reputation and influence in terms of suicide prevention in India and in other countries. So Dr. Vijayakumar is head of Department of Psychiatry at the Voluntary Health Services in Chennai as well. She's an Honorary Associate Professor at the University of Melbourne in Australia and Honorary Adjunct Professor at the University of Griffith in Queensland, Australia. She's a member of WHO's Network for Suicide Research and Prevention and the International Academy of Suicide Research. And those of you who may have attended the World Health Organization's Mental Health Forum 3 weeks ago will have heard her speaking in that forum as well, as she does quite frequently. So Dr. Vijayakumar is former Vice President of the International Association for Suicide Prevention. So it gives a lot of pleasure, Lakshmi. We're looking forward to hearing you speak about suicide in women and men in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen, for introducing me. It's always a pleasure and privilege to be introduced by a friend, not only a friend, but an illustrious past president of the World Psychiatric Association and a researcher worldwide known. So it's my pleasure to talk about suicide in women. I'm generally globally, not necessarily to this region, because I think this is a topic which has not been addressed very frequently, because suicide has always been thought to be a male phenomenon and not a female phenomenon. But actually, the situation is quite different. George? Yeah. So, okay, this is the, you must have seen the world suicide map quite often, but this is the world map of suicide among women. And if you see the suicide rate in women, you'll find that India has a high suicide rate. And then you see Guyana has one of the highest female suicide rates. So, and Suriname. And then there we have countries in Africa, countries in Vijayakumar and some of the countries. And then you see some of the areas here also, which has a high suicide rates. Okay, so the suicide rate, and even in the European and the North American continent, you can see that the suicide rate in women is quite high. It's not low. And if you look at what we need to look at is the male-female ratio of suicide. Okay, how many males versus how many females, you know? And if you look at the concept of how we think that male suicide is more, it is mostly in the European countries where the suicide rate is more than 5:1. That is 5 times more men than women. But if you look at countries, huge countries like India and China, they are the 2 countries which has a maximum number of suicides. You find that the ratio is less than 2:1. That is, in fact, in India, it is 1.4:1. So there are more or less equal number of male and female suicide, and also in parts of Africa, Middle East, and so on. So this excessive male rates is found in Europe and in some parts of the South American countries. And that has kind of distorted our view that suicides are more in men. So if this is the latest 2019 statistics from WHO, and you can see that unfortunately Guyana is #2, both in terms of all suicides and also in terms of female suicides. And if you look at the number of deaths, of course, it's a totally different picture. You find that India and China, they contribute, particularly for females. India and China, if you add up, they constitute almost 50–60% of suicides in women, though the population constitution is only 34% of women. For 34% of women, they contribute 60% of suicides. So if you disaggregate and look at it from various regions of the world, okay, if you look at it, the global rate, you can see that the male-female ratio is almost 3:1, okay. But then if you could look at low and middle income countries, you see the gap is very low. So in many of the low middle income countries, it is the more female-male ratio is very less. But if you see a high income countries, it is pretty high. Much more male die by suicide than females. And then even in the low middle income countries, there are, George, next please. Yeah. So even among the low income countries, if you divide it by the African region, American region, and Eastern Mediterranean region, the African region, if you see, you find that male suicides is more or less corresponding to the female suicide rates, okay? And in the American region, definitely 3 times more men than women. And then in Eastern Mediterranean, you can see that there is a spike. Younger age group, more female suicides, and then it kind of, the gap is very narrow, okay? So more female suicides. It's not moving. Next, please. Can I say next and then move on? Yeah, thank you. Next, please. Oh, no. Oh, okay. No, next one. No. Next. Yeah. Got it. Yeah, can you go to the previous slide, please? Before. Next one. Go to slide number 8, please. Yeah. We are not able to see the entire screen, George.
It's all okay, thanks.
Okay, let me go on while there's things are being started out. If you look at the European region, are you able to see the?
Yes, all's well.
Okay, here it's not well, but that's okay. If you look at the European region, you can see that, as I said, 5 or 6 times more men die by suicide. Whereas if you look at the Southeast Asian region, you see that in the young age group below the age of 30, more women die by suicide than men actually. So if you look at young women, more suicide in the Southeast Asian region and in the Western Pacific region. Now, these two are the 2 big populous countries of India and China. So young women in these countries have much higher suicide rate than men. Next, please. Yes, if you look at the World Bank region, amongst the high income groups, the suicide number of deaths is high in US, Japan, and Korea. And in the upper middle income, it is China, South Africa, and Russia. And in the lower middle, it is India, Pakistan, Vietnam, all are population countries. And in low income, it is Ethiopia, Congo, and Korea. Next, please. Again, this is a bit interesting. If you look at the, this is the latest statistics. It shows the global rate, the men rate, and the women rate. And if you find, yes, globally men more suicides, and in high income countries, much more men than women, and in low income countries, much more men than women. But in upper middle and middle income countries, the gap is very narrow. It is as though in upper middle and lower middle income countries where women are slowly emerging out, they have more pressures and the suicide rate is more. Whereas in the extremes, the men are have more suicides. Okay. Next, please. I think this you would have heard by now, so I don't want to go. But all I wanted to say is it does increase. So what about the lethality of methods in men and women? In high income countries, majority of the women use psychotropics, then carbon monoxide poisoning and hanging. But in low and middle income countries, they use more highly lethal methods like pesticides, self-immolation, hanging. Okay. So the mortality and case fatality is very high for pesticides. Okay. And if you look at the pesticide poisoning, which is also very high in Guyana, you find that that's what the method of suicide, which is the #1 in the world. The maximum number of suicides in the world are committed by consumption of pesticides poisoning. And it is negligible in Europe and in high income countries, but it is the low income countries which have reduced access to medical facilities, increased access to pesticides and impulsivity, and young people, the combination produces a lot of young suicides, particularly female suicides. Next, please. And again, this form of self-immolation. Self-immolation is a method where you set fire to yourself. It's very common in the Middle East, Sri Lanka, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, in all these countries. Okay. And you find that this is the only method of suicide where women outnumber men. And you cannot call it as a less lethal method of suicide because it is a highly lethal method of suicide. Not only is it a highly lethal method of suicide, it leaves scars for the rest of your life. You carry the scars for the rest of your lives. And this is the only method in the world where women outnumber men. Next, please. Now, what is the relationship between, we always talk about depression, mental health issues, and their association to suicide. Now, psychological autopsy studies from the developed countries have told us that 80 to 90% of people who die by suicide have a mental health disorder. Okay. But in many of the psychological autopsy studies done in the lower and middle income countries, in India, China, Sri Lanka, and other places, we find only 50 to 60% have a mental disorder. Okay. And actually this is a really interesting graph which plots the prevalence of mental disorders and the suicide rate in various countries of the 163 countries in the world. And you find absolutely no correlation. So the prevalence of mental disorders has no correlation to the suicide rate of any country. So to say only if we treat mental disorders, suicide will come down, really doesn't wash. Next, please. And so this is the same for depression. It's slightly more correlation, but again, not statistically significant. There is somewhat a little bit, you can see a little bit of more correlation in terms of, see, this is a graph which you can go and you can go to one country and find out the prevalence of depression, the suicide rate, and it will give you, and we don't find a correlation. So which makes us rethink what we should do. Next, please. Of the psychological autopsy studies, particularly if you look at the female suicides, these are the pooled relative risks which we find: depressive disorders, anxiety, schizophrenia, bipolar, anorexia, alcohol dependence, and opioid dependence. Next, please. Now, the other big thing is that marriage being very protective and preventing you from suicide. In many low and middle income countries, marriage is very protective for men and is a big risk factor for women. Okay. This study from China shows that being married increases your risk of suicide 2 point, marital status, the odds ratio is 2.7. Okay. And this is a national psychological autopsy, national prevalence study of more than 1,000 people or something like that. Next, please. It is not that it is protective only for in low and middle, not protective in low and middle income countries. It is not even in the United States of America. If you look at this, this is the graph which shows where you have the divorce laws, where you can, what do you call that? Unilateral divorce law. Okay, you have unilateral divorce law. You can apply for a divorce. A woman has the power to apply for a divorce. And this plots when the unilateral divorce laws were applied and the suicide rate. And you can find that there is no difference between, and it compares all the states. Okay, you find no difference in people who are less than 19 years old. The suicide rate and the universal application of the universal divorce laws has no effect, and not over people above 65. But if you see people from 25 to 50, you can see that this line is when the universal divorce laws are applied. You can see there is a reduction. Once you give the power to the woman to say no to a difficult marriage or a distressing marriage, the suicide rate comes down, even in the US. Next, please. So it's no more fair to talk that marriage is being protected, particularly for women. So, and many of these countries, the marriage in young girls is a phenomenon. 50%, 50 to 60% of these women in this large populated period like Bangladesh, Afghanistan, India, Nepal, and even Pakistan, 50 to 60% of them are married below the age of 18. So can you imagine being married below the age of 18 when you don't have the economic resources or the emotional ability to handle the problems? Next, please. And this is actually a study from the US where you find that people who had abortions had high suicide rate than people who are even denied abortion. People who had abortions and people who are denied abortions had higher suicide rates than other people. And this is not in the first week. Even after 5 years, you see that the risk is high. Next, please. Of late, we are seeing a lot of people having fertility, women with fertility issues, and the suicide risk is very high in those women who have gone through fertility treatment and have not been successful. As I said, the hazard ratio is 2.43. If you have gone through a fertility treatment and you have not, it has not been successful, the hazard ratio becomes 2.43. Next, please. The other issue is that the economic factors and the economic downturns affects men and has no impact on, not much of an impact on women, which is not true. If you look at this statistics, you can see that women have, following the economic crisis, the women have higher suicide rate. What has been challenging and found is women who have never worked, the suicide rate doesn't change. But when a woman works and is employed, and due to an economic crisis that employment is withdrawn or she loses the job, then the suicide rate goes high. And even now, after the COVID, we see the suicide rate in Japanese women rising because many of them have lost the jobs. And the highest increase in suicide now currently today is in the Japanese women. Next, please. I don't want to talk much because I have my friend Prabha who will be talking to you extensively about perinatal suicidal risk. She has done a lot of work on that. But again, pregnancy-related suicide is pretty high. Next, please. This is large population-based studies. More than 10,000 women stratified population studies which have been formed. And this is the correlation between domestic interpartner violence and suicidal ideation. It is extremely high. And still, we have the lowest research or interventions to address this issue to reduce suicide in women. Next, please. Again, this is another study which has been done in South Asia. And you find that any woman who has been exposed to physical or sexual violence more than physical violence, have high suicide rate, and a person who has been exposed to both have a 61% increase in suicidal ideation. Next, please. We have the Rohingya refugees from Myanmar into Bangladesh and in India. And if you look at the next, please, the maternal mortality rate in those refugees in the Thailand-Myanmar border, it is 16.4 per live births. Compare it to UK at 0.8. Okay. See, these refugee women, see, there are 24 million refugees in the world. 84% of them are in low and middle income countries, which are already struggling. And 40% of them are children, and they are exposed to violence. And many of the women have to face violence, physical, sexual, harassment, everything. And it is not surprising that the suicidal rate amongst the refugees, we did a systematic review of suicide among refugees. Unlike the general population, among the refugee population, suicide is more in women than men. Next, please. What about religion? Religion is supposed to be a protective factor. I think we have some other session. Maybe I'll talk a little bit more. But if you look at women from the Muslim religion, it is not protecting them. It is protecting the men in the Muslim region, but not in the women. I will talk a little bit more when we talk about religion, and I won't do this. So what are the interventions which have been done to prevent suicide in women? Can you believe that there is only one psychological autopsy study of suicide in women, which was done 20 years back in Norway? Okay. Until date, there is only one intervention which has been tailored only for reducing suicide in women. We do not have a specific intervention for suicide at all. We don't have any studies. This is the only study in Iran where Ahmadi tried to reduce suicide, particularly by self-immolation. So he compared two districts, and in one of the districts, he did a lot of awareness program, and then lived experience talks by people who have survived self-immolation to the young women, and video talks and provision of help for people who, young women. And there were a lot of painting. There was mostly awareness raising and lived experience share. That was the intervention. Next, please. And you can see in that village, which is the intervention village, the prevalence of suicidal ideation and suicide attempts was much more, whereas in the comparative district, the suicide attempts actually increased by, this is by self-immolation. So even something difficult to reduce access to, like self-immolation, if you are able to increase awareness, if you are able to provide help, if you are able to provide alternative forms of coping with stress, suicides can be reduced. Next, please. I did a small study and compared about 680 people who have attempted suicide, men and women. I did not find any difference between men and women who have attempted suicide in terms of their depression score, suicide intent scale, well-being index, impulsivity scale, or anger index. I didn't find any difference. Next, please. The only difference I found was in their help-seeking behavior. Okay, women sought out more help. They went to the medical doctors much more. They have spoken about their suicidal ideas to the relatives, and compared to the men. That was the only thing. So we have these women who are willing to go for help, but they have not been identified and supported and given services. Next, please. This is another small experiment which I did. See, based on pesticide suicide. These are the 4 states in India which have 60% of pesticide suicide and 60% of farmers suicide. Farmers who that's a whole thing. I don't want to go into it, but it is a big problem. It's a political issue. And a lot of farmers died by suicides because many of them changed from subsistence farming to crop farming, ended up in a debt trap, and many of them died. So many of the middle-aged 40 to 50 years farmers died, leaving the women to hold and raise the family. Okay. So along with us, Center for Sustainable Agriculture, we identified 4 villages and empowered these 4 women to use what is, and the pesticide was the easiest form of easiest available form of suicide. So we encouraged 4 villages to do what is known as non-pesticide management of pesticide using chili garlic paste, cow dung paste, female pheromones. Next, please. These are the women who have been widowed, from the 4 villages. Next, please. And then you can see, after empowering them with this, the number of suicides in these non-pesticide management villages after non-pesticide management came down drastically when compared to the neighboring chemical pesticide villages. Not only that, these women became much more financially stable because their products were selling better because it was organic, and they were not getting buy seeds or things from the people, so they don't have to spend money. So much so they form a cooperative and bought a neem seed crushing machine. And these 4 villages have expanded to 10 villages, and this has become an island of villages where no suicides happen. Next, please. So how can we prevent suicide, particularly in low and middle income countries? We do have to provide education and economic security. And then we have to prohibit child forced marriages, arranged marriages, all the marriage related issues. And then media portrayal of women and suicide. See, this is a small experiment which we did in Chennai, where any soap opera you see, when a woman faces an interpersonal crisis, she'll be shown going into the kitchen, pouring kerosene and setting herself on fire. So we got all the media producers, the soap opera producers, gave them an awareness half-a-day program, and all of them pledged that they will not show self-immolation in their soap operas anymore, which happened in 2015. Okay, compared to 2015, suicide by self-immolation in women in Tamil Nadu has come down by 65%. So that is the effect of media. So, and many of the countries have women-related programs, maternal and child programs. So we can nest the suicide prevention programs in many of these programs, and that is the way to go forward. But we have a lot to go. The road is very, very, very long because we are all privileged. We are all educated. We are sitting here. We are talking about women. But there are so many women who do not have access to food, access to education. Their social status is poor, and they feel helpless, hopeless, and naturally they feel suicide may be an option. I am just going to show a suicide note which I carried with me for almost 7 years until I said, okay, it's enough, because that was a reminder for me that I should never ever stop working for reducing suicides, particularly in women. Can I have the next slide, please? And this is the slide. This is Amma and Appa's mom and dad in India. It says, please forgive us. We know we are a burden to you. You want us to get married, but we have no money. We are not educated. We have been good daughters, but the world wants money. We hope that one of us will be born as a son to you in our next life. And the 3 of them hung themselves together. And the father brought this suicide note to me. So this is the state of a majority of women in low and middle income countries. And I think it has been ignored area for a long time, both in terms of research, in terms of implementation, in terms of interventions. And I think unless we reduce suicide in young women, we will not be able to achieve the sustainable development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lakshmi.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you. This is
What time is it there in Australia now?
it's coming up to 6 a.m.
Oh
It's
dear.
5. That's a good way to start the day.
Thank you. Thank you for being there at such an early hour.
Well, it's as I say, it's a real pleasure to be here, particularly with you, Lakshmi. I'm seeing many messages here too, saying awesome presentation. I've learned so much. And there was a listener who said who particularly appreciated the study with organic pesticides. So there are accolades coming through on the chat for the presentation. Thank you, Lakshmi. And I'd like to ask anyone who in this audience to ask a question who's on the video to send it through in the chat. And do you have questions from the audience in the auditorium?
Are there any questions in the audience?
In the meantime, Lakshmi, could I ask you, because I'm aware when you were speaking in the WHO forum last 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, that you talked about the removal of, or the campaign to remove laws against suicide. So preventing it, making sure it's no longer a criminal offence. Then I see we have another question from to follow.
Okay, is it related to decriminalization?
Yes, yes.
Okay, it is completely an archaic law to criminalize attempted suicide. Okay, and recently in September, the Reuters Foundation and the Global Mental Health brought out a report on decriminalization and internationally. And in that, we find that there are only 19 countries in which suicide is still a crime. Okay, and 15 of them belong to the British Commonwealth countries. In this region, I think it is Guyana, St. Lucia, Bahamas, where attempted suicide is a crime. So one of the ways to address this is to go to the Commonwealth countries. They meet every year, the ministers meet and say that if you remove this, 15 countries go off. And there are other 20 countries which follow the Sharia law. I have been working for decriminalization in India for over a decade. Helen knows about it. It has gone through a lot of ups and downs. We should have decriminalized it as early as 1974. But unfortunately, the government collapsed and the bill lapsed. And since then, we had to lobby the National Law Commission to give a report saying that it should be decriminalized. And then we found that the legislator has to change it. So we asked the legislator to change it, but the legislator was sitting on it. And then there was another commission which was supposed to identify redundant laws. We did that, but that also didn't pan through until finally the India passed a mental health bill. In that which was passed by both the parliament. And in that mental health bill, what it says is, in spite of what is, they cannot remove the IPC 309, but what they said was, in spite of what is in IPC 309, a person who has attempted suicide should be considered to be under severe stress and should not be punished. So in effect, it made the penal code a redundant, but still it is there. So even though you're not punished, there is a legal obligation to report it, which causes harassment. Okay. So we are now working with the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has asked the government of India to clarify this. So that is where it is now. And hopefully soon it will be removed. But this is a law which needs to be gone even from Guyana. And I am very, very happy today that the health minister has categorically said that before the end of this year, they will pass a law and remove this. And that's a fantastic news for me.
Yes, thank you, Lakshmi. And Ms. Collins was asking a question, please. You had your hand up.
Yeah. Yeah?
Yeah, are you there, Ms. Collins? Ms. Shellen Collins? No,
There is a person here who is wanting.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for
Please
that.
go.
That was a very interesting lecture. My question is about the intervention study that you presented, the data that you presented with the intervention. The outcome was suicide ideation decreased after intervention, but suicide attempts increased.
No, suicide attempt also decreased.
Oh, in both of those
Yeah.
districts and towns. Thank you.
Thank you. What was the question, Helen?
I'm not sure. There was a participant, not a panelist, with the hand up, and that's now down. So, and
Okay.
can't hear that. There is a comment. I'd like to invite any further questions. There is a comment in the panel that removing the law will increase the rate of suicide.
Removing the law will increase the rate of suicide in Guyana? I don't think so. There is no history. There is no data where attempted suicide law has been removed and suicide has increased. In fact, it's the opposite. Once the law has been removed, the suicide rate has come down because people are able to access help immediately in the golden hour and treatment is possible. And there was no delay in the treatment possible. So most of the countries where they have removed the law, the suicide rate has decreased. Not one country has it increased. Does that answer your question? Whoever it is who has asked me in the chat box?
Yes, there was.
Yeah,
well,
even with the law in place, people still attempt suicide. That's true. Just because you have a law, your human distress doesn't reduce, and you don't think that there is a law, I should not attempt suicide. It's not a deterrent at all.
Yeah, so thank you. And likewise, that's right, the law doesn't stop people attempting suicide, but it does stop them reaching help, as you say. But returning to the topic of women's suicide, Lakshmi, I think the note that you show is very moving, the suicide note, and the women's plight around the world who are married early or caught in impossible situations, you bring out so clearly. I wonder if you could comment on the fact that if we go back 30 years, the rate of women's suicide in China and India was quite similar. But as you pointed out now, the rate of women's suicide, or the ratio male to female to male, is much reduced. Do you have a comment on that?
See, even in India, if you look at it in terms of 20 years, and in China, the suicide rate in women have reduced. Even in the last 10 years, in India, the suicide rate in women have reduced. Before, the ratio between men and women used to be 1.4:1. Now it is 2:1. So there is, and that I think is totally tied to education and economic independence of the women. The more education and economic independence happens, then the women's suicide rate comes down.
Well, thank you. I think that's a very clear statement that we take from you in this. And the other very important question that you raise is that the rate of suicide is not necessarily tied to the rate of mental disorders, including suicide. Although, of course, individually, that people with depression may be at higher risk than those without.
So, I don't know, this is my theory. I think in the developed world, there is so much of emphasis on mental disorders that you lose out on the social factors which drives a person to suicide. And in many of our developing countries, we focus only on social factors and we don't focus enough on mental disorders. So there has to be a balance in both the countries, that both mental health issues and social determinants and social factors have to be addressed together in any society to reduce suicide.
Yes, thank you. And we see a rich run of commentary in the chat, if you can see that. But Jerry Diaz has commented that culturally, male chauvinistic society women remained submissive and had no voice. That has changed now, but still we have a long way to go in a closed society. Another commonist commentator, Michelle, has said education to reduce the stigma when reaching out for help.
Absolutely. I agree with the comments completely.
And social and emotional factors are key, as I think you commented as well. So it is that that being both comprehensive in consideration and a balance of factors that protect the individual as well as make the conditions of life more bearable for women and more satisfying for everybody.
Yeah, I'm still amazed by the fact that we have only one psychological autopsy study on suicide in women. Yes. And a couple of interventions, which I think speaks volumes about the need to address this. Yeah,
I think this is startling, and we see there's a commentator, Colin Haynes, is saying there is some contradiction because more education increases suicide with economic changes. So as you pointed out, when women are employed, they become perhaps vulnerable also to economic swings in different ways.
Yeah.
And collective awareness is important, as well as how do we strike the balance.
I think how we strike that balance is to, as mental health professionals or any professionals, not to look at it only from a mental health perspective, but from a cultural perspective, and give equal weightage to the context and the culture in which the person comes from. We are not trained for that. We are trained to look at the DSM tick, 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 and we go ahead with the treatment. So I think we need to address that. And also some of the social factors, like they said, empowerment of women, economic independence, education, reducing discrimination, reducing stigma, all that will definitely make a difference.
Well, thank you, Lakshmi. I think the comments continue, but we're coming close to the hour. There's one panelist who would like to be unmuted to speak. I don't have the power to do that, but we would welcome that if that's possible. I think we should draw this to a close, but note the last comment here that, well, it comments that it's not formal education, but rather life or learning about emotions and learning mental health education in schools. That's another important factor.
Absolutely.
Perhaps you'd like to comment
totally
on that.
agree. Yeah, totally agree. I mean, I don't think we should, the suicide rate in major, even in the countries where it is reducing, in the young people, it is increasing. And that is a cause for concern. And I don't think we are providing the best environment for the young people. I mean, we are talking to them about resilience, ability to tolerate stress, ability to tolerate, but look at today's society. It's all instant message, instant coffee, instant love, instant hate, and if you don't like, you delete everything. But life doesn't happen like that,
Yeah. So Lakshmi, thank you. Well, I think that's a fine way to finish. You've clearly stimulated a very active debate, and I thank the audience and both in the auditorium and remotely.